Me? I've always loved porters. Through freezing rain and biting wind, across rivers, mountains, and endless deserts.
Death Stranding 2, On the Beach, is the long-awaited sequel to Hideo Kojima's divisive yet profoundly introspective 2019 title, Death Stranding, a game which recently we covered on this channel and I still consider truly a one-of-a-kind experience. The sequel is a fascinating follow-up. It expands on the original in meaningful ways, offering more tools, more options for self-expression, and new approaches to problem-solving. Yet, it also steps away from some of the foundational elements that define the gameplay loop of its predecessor. It's an experience that may surprise, perhaps even alienate those who expected a straightforward continuation of what came before. If you are hoping for a retread of the original formula, you might walk away from this sequel feeling conflicted or even disappointed. Personally, I see these changes as deliberate and thematically grounded. Death Stranding 2 shifts the philosophical focus. Whilst the first game embraced Kobo Abe's concept of the rope, connection over conflict, this sequel asks a more complicated question. Are sticks sometimes necessary? This duality gives the sequel a more complex thematic landscape. While it may feel like a departure, it still carries the emotional and conceptual DNA of the original. At its core, Death Stranding 2 feels like a continuation of Kojima's post-pandemic reflections, born out of his frustrations during COVID, his deeper meditations on connection, and his growing awareness of his own mortality and the legacy as a creator. It's an overwhelming experience at times, dense, strange, and even convoluted, but when you look past the eccentricness, what emerges is something thoughtful, raw, and deeply human. As you can probably tell from this intro alone, I have a lot to unpack, but before we dive into the themes and the ideas of Death Stranding 2, a quick spoiler warning for this video, as I will be covering majority of the story elements and thematic content. So if you still haven't finished this game, I recommend coming back once you've done so, and with that being said, let's begin and get into my video for Death Stranding 2.
-61. Now the wind cuts the leaves like a knife, and the sun is out of sight. I see the world they build to lose at the trial, what is left and what is right. I made the worst mistake one can make, pretending and playing blind. What is it I'm trying to find?
Now I would like to discuss the development of Death Stranding 2, as I do feel that this plays an integral role in understanding how Death Stranding 2 came to be. The game that it was, shaped up both narratively and gameplay wise, how it elevated on the first and built on it, but also deviated, and it was a massive departure from much of the groundwork that the first game really laid out. I think it's important to really just explore these ideas, and it starts with the mixed critical reception but impressive milestones of 10 million players that came with the first Death Stranding. And with this success, Hideo Kojima turned his attention to developing a sequel. Work on the initial script began, but Death Stranding 2 would not come together without facing significant challenges. The original game emphasized the importance of connection, with the chiral network serving as an allegory for a hyper-connected online world. Kojima initially envisioned a different direction for the sequel. However, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, his perspective shifted. He witnessed a profound societal transformation as the in-person rituals of everyday life, meetings, social events, school functions, migrated entirely online. This shift mirrored the digital dependencies portrayed in Death Stranding, and it became impossible to ignore. The first major hurdle came with the pandemic itself, which forced much of the development process into a remote setting. On-site production halted and the casting had to be done over Zoom. Kojima later described this as one of the worst experiences, noting how difficult it was to convey subtlety and emotion, nuance, through a screen, calling it almost impossible. Australia, my homeland, the key setting for Death Stranding 2, was another victim of the pandemic's limitations. Kojima had intended to scout the country himself, but travel restrictions made it impossible. He had to rely on remote location scouts, another experience that left him frustrated. "You can't feel things through a screen," he remarked, further reinforcing his growing skepticism about digital reliance. Isolated in his office during lockdown, Kojima observed a world gripped by fear and scarcity, people stockpiling essentials, streets deserted. He sat alone, wondering if he'd ever see another human being again, in person that is. It was in this solitude that the realization struck. The world was beginning to resemble the very themes he had explored through the chiral network. The eerie parallel pushed him into a state of dismay and forced him to reconsider the story he wanted to tell with Death Stranding 2. Then things took a darker turn. In 2020, Kojima experienced a serious health scare. Intense pain in his eyes left him unable to work or even enjoy films, one of his greatest passions. He feared he might never recover, let alone create another game. In that moment of uncertainty and despair, he began documenting all of his remaining creative ideas for both games and films, thinking of it as a will of sorts, he would later remark. Kojima would go on to describe Death Stranding 2 as the most difficult challenge of his career, admitting that he nearly abandoned the project entirely. It was only after reconnecting, funny little pun there, with the core message that he found the will to continue. That revelation became the new foundation of the game, that it's not just connection that matters, but the physical human connection, the kind of experience shared in spaces through presence, touch, and real emotional intimacy. From that understanding, the sequel evolved into a cautionary tale about society's increasing dependencies on digital forms of connection. At the heart of Death Stranding 2, the haunting question was etched into its marketing and narrative alike: should we have connected? And that's no better segue than to now get into the story for Death Stranding. The story of Death Stranding 2 picks up 11 months after the events of the first game. Sam and Lou, his former bridge baby and now close companion, have been living a quiet life off the grid, following the successful reconnection of the United Cities of America. The peaceful days, however, are soon disrupted when Fragile arrives with a new request. She comes representing a newly formed third-party organization known as Drawbridge, and asks Sam to help establish a chiral network link through Mexico. Without much hesitation, Sam agrees, entrusting Lou to Fragile's care whilst he sets off on the mission. The initial journey serves as the introductory section, relatively calm and familiar in tone as Sam successfully reactivates the chiral network and reconnects the region of Mexico with little resistance. But things take a sudden and devastating turn on the way back. Sam encounters a mysterious new threat, red-veiled figures known as ghost mechs. And then he returns to find a tragedy awaiting him. Both Fragile and Lou have been attacked, shot by one of the red-clad assailants. The culprit is soon revealed to be Higgs, who has somehow returned, hell-bent on vengeance against Sam and Fragile. The confrontation ends in heartbreak as Lou is killed in this assault, setting the stage for a far darker and more personal journey ahead. In attempts to help Sam overcome his grief and loss of Lou, Fragile makes the proposition offering Sam a position on Drawbridge, as a new request to link Australia to the chiral network has taken center stage and will need to be completed, traversing through a new phenomenon known as the Plate Gates, which allows them to traverse the tar pits that segregate each continent and allows them to traverse to Australia and link it to the chiral network as this third party. This is where the main story really starts to unfold here and take place as Sam's journey through grief, loss, and the trials and tribulations that come with it, and stopping Higgs all come into full play here. All of this to set up a sense of context for the themes that we will be discussing going forward for Death Stranding 2. So without delay, let's get into the many different themes that underpin Death Stranding 2. There are many themes that all intertwine together to make the crystallizing message of Death Stranding 2, but one of the core and central themes is interrogated through our growing reliance on digital connection. Where the original game championed the importance of building connections, physical, emotional, and spiritual, the sequel asks a much more sobering question: should we have connected? This central inquiry doesn't reject the value of connection, but it reframes it, especially in light of the global experiences brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, which deeply influenced Kojima's approach to this sequel. In Death Stranding 2, the chiral network becomes a clear allegory for the internet and digital connectivity, a tool that links people across vast distances, but also fosters a dependency that can feel hollow. While the first game celebrated the act of rebuilding a fractured world through this network, the sequel explores the problems that come with it. It still acknowledges the role of digital connection, but it posits that something vital is lost when it replaces real human interaction. This idea is expressed through the game's emphasis on physical presence, being there with somebody, not simply exchanging data or messages, but sharing space. The game highlights the irreplaceable quality of real human connection through the ability to share a physical environment, the nuance of body language, gestures, posture, presence, intimacy of touch, emotional co-regulation, the subconscious way of which presence of others can really stabilize us emotionally. These are all aspects that digital communication, no matter how advanced, cannot replicate. A voice call or hologram can't replace a shared laugh, a comforting hug, or a heartfelt conversation face to face. Connection just isn't about information being transferred, it's about empathy, presence, and resonance. Death Stranding 2 reinforces this through smaller, intimate moments. Whether it's laughing at a friend's joke, or holding someone's hand, or simply traveling together, these experiences highlight many forms of meaningful connection that we can take in this world. Interestingly, Death Stranding 2 is also much more playful and light-hearted in its tone than its predecessor. At first, this tonal shift, filled with oddball humor and lighter moments, may feel jarring when contrasted with scenes of grief, loss, and trauma, but this juxtaposition is intentional. The moments of levity aren't distractions from the game's emotional core, they are a part of it. They act as emotional counterweights, grounding the player in warmth and camaraderie amidst an otherwise bleak narrative. One of the clearest examples of this is the inclusion of the DHV Magellan, a vessel that serves not just as transportation, but as a metaphorical and literal hub for human connection. It becomes a place where Sam, and by extension the player, forms real-time bonds with the cast of traveling companions. Unlike the holographic, often impersonal interactions of the first game, these relationships feel alive, dynamic, and evolving, akin to building a party in a traditional JRPG. These shared journeys help reinforce the game's point. Connection thrives through presence. Moments aboard the Magellan singing raindrops, snapping photos, or watching Dollman's bizarre dance routines may seem whimsical, but they are deeply intentional. They are not just coping mechanisms for Sam's trauma, they are expressions of healing through community, and they reaffirm the value of shared experiences in a post-apocalyptic world. Sam himself embodies this transformation, where the first game portrayed him as an isolated, reluctant courier, burdened by emotional detachment. Death Stranding 2 continues his journey towards openness. He grows into someone who no longer avoids others but instead seeks them out, embraces them, and crucially learns to be present with them. It's a slow journey, and whilst I do say this, it still is slow steps for Sam, but he is a lot more of a chatty character in this game. He does have a bit more dialogue, a bit more presence. He's not as reserved and as mumbly as he was in the first game. This evolution of Sam ties directly into another central theme: loss and memory. The game suggests that connection transcends death, not just through digital means or memory, but through the bonds we cultivate while alive. These bonds endure and shape the future, even in absence. They are what sustains us. At its core, Death Stranding 2 doesn't reject connection, it simply asks us to examine the nature of the connection we forge. Are they real or synthetic? Are they built on presence, care, and vulnerability, or on convenience and abstraction? The game urges us and argues that true human connection requires presence, and sometimes to rebuild the world it isn't enough to be linked, we must be there together to give a helping hand.
World divided, made whole, with a few sticks for encouragement. The UCA's precursor, the United States of America, had a prominent gun culture. A distinctly American philosophy, and one which would appear to have spread to this continent. The more we seek to unite the people with metaphorical ropes, the more essential sticks seem to become.
Hideo Kojima has often spoken about the symbolism of the stick and the rope. In the original Death Stranding, his aim was to create a game centered around the rope, an emblem of connection, cooperation, and unity. With Death Stranding 2, however, he seeks to strike a balance between the two. The rope still represents connection, but the stick symbolizes violence, defense, and more importantly, boundaries, which emerge as a necessary counterpoint. The sequel delves into the dual nature of connection, suggesting that while bonds bring people together, they can also give rise to conflict. In some cases, the stick may just be as essential of a tool as the rope. The game explores the dangers of hyperconnectedness, particularly in the digital age. Higgs, now an even more formidable antagonist, manipulates the chiral network to travel and manifest destructive ghost mechs. Meanwhile, APAS, a new governing presence, expands the network to unify humanity into a collective hive mind, stripping individuals of autonomy. Much like Metal Gear Solid 2, Death Stranding 2 critiques the over-reliance on digital systems, AI, and highlights the risks of mass surveillance, exploitation, and the spread of misinformation. It also addresses the promise of safety which can be used to justify extreme measures. The organization Bridges conducts inhumane experiments on BBs, literal unborn children, treating them as tools in the name of national security. It's an unsettling metaphor that underscores the potential for dehumanization when fear is prioritized over ethics. Yet the game doesn't dwell on cynicism, it offers a message of hope that we can move forward and that clinging to the past only chains us to old mistakes. Characters like Sam and Fragile choose growth, choosing to let go of trauma and embrace change. In contrast, Higgs remains trapped by vengeance and an obsession with Amelie that was present in the first game, standing as the foil to Sam's evolution. They embody the tension between progress and stagnation. The theme is further enriched through the character of Nirvana, whose story ties together the fates of Sam, Lucy, and Lou. Haunted by his past, particularly abandoning Lucy, Neil returns in a redemptive arc. He falsely claims to be the father of Lucy's child in order to shield her from experimentation, sacrificing himself in the process. It's an act of love and atonement that illustrates when the stick, i.e. confrontation and protection, is wielded not out of aggression but out of care. Death Stranding 2 raises important questions. Is the stick merely a weapon, or is it a symbol of necessary boundaries? Is it a metaphor for confrontation, self-defense, or autonomy? When the rope connects, it is the stick that safeguards identity and privacy. When connection becomes coercion, when unity becomes control, as seen with APAS, it ceases to be connection at all. What defines us, the game argues, is not just our links to others, but our ability to remain autonomous within those links. Ultimately, Death Stranding 2 suggests that both the rope and the stick are essential. The rope brings us together, cherishing the things dearest to us, but the stick represents the capacity to protect what matters, to draw lines, and to confront threats when needed. Rather than rejecting connection, the game encourages us to question how we connect and what we may sacrifice in the process. In Death Stranding 1, one of the most prominent motifs was connection, represented symbolically through objects like the cuffs, umbilical cords, and even literal bridges between the worlds of the living and the dead. These elements reinforce the game's central message, that connection is vital, even across boundaries we don't fully understand. In Death Stranding 2, a new motif emerges, one that articulates its message even more clearly. The circle. The circle symbolizes many things: eternity, repetition, continuity, but most significantly, it represents loops. Unlike the cuff link interface of the first game, this time you navigate the world using a ring. The journey through Australia, the core trek of the game itself, is a loop, one that brings you back to where you began, but changed. Even the loop of Drawbridge, the organization you work with, features a rising sun, another circle, another loop hovering over a bridge. This sense of looping and reflection left a strong impression on me throughout my playthrough. Death Stranding 2 feels to Death Stranding 1 what Metal Gear Solid 2 felt like to Metal Gear Solid 1. A subversion, an echo of its predecessor. It starts off feeling familiar only to slowly peel back its layers, revealing something far more complex. It echoes the aesthetics of the first game with its own unique flair. Cyborg-like characters, ghost mechs, and heightened focus on the perils of over-reliance on digital systems and artificial intelligence. These themes even more urgent today than they were when the original launched. But beyond the aesthetics of philosophical callbacks, Death Stranding 2 plays with the idea of cycles of repetition, rebirth, and questioning of reality. The motif of the circle supports this, reflecting the narrative arcs of the characters like Higgs, whose resurrection ties directly to the themes of rebirth, as well as Fragile and the return of Lou in the form of Tomorrow. These characters all embody change through reoccurrence. Circles in this context also symbolize the eternal connection, bonds that persist even in death. Fragile puts it best when she says to Sam, "Death can't tear us apart. We will always be connected on the beach." It's a powerful line, suggestive that death isn't the final end, but a point of return, an opportunity for rest, reset, and reconnection. The cycle of life and our place within it is central to the human experience that Death Stranding 2 explores. Despite all the metaphors, circles, and loops, the stick and the rope, the Death Stranding 2 ultimately delivers a hopeful message. The future is shaped by the choices we make today. It may seem fragile, even predetermined at times, but it is never beyond repair. We can always mend it, and even when our individual journeys come to an end, the connection we've built, the bonds that define us, endure. Much of the stories that Kojima has written over the years really do reflect a lot of his interpersonal experiences that he has shared in his life. Metal Gear Solid was a close series to Kojima with the theme of how do we surpass or live up to the legacy of those we care about, particularly parents and living legends that we have built up. Death Stranding 2, however, puts us in the flip side of that. It puts us in the role of the parent, with the relationship between Sam and Lou. Sam's relationship with Lou as a pseudo-parent throughout the first, and what ultimately eventuates in the reveal that Lou is in fact the child that Sam believed he had lost when he lost his wife Lucy. Then, to close out, that Tomorrow is, in fact, Lou all grown up. It explores and retreads this father's journey and this relationship in a very offbeat way. But for the majority of the story, it also is the process of denial and loss, the fragility of life itself, and even when someone is gone, it ponders on how connections can still be sustained and remained unsevered. Death Stranding 2 explores death, loss, and grief, but it isn't just through how one navigates and overcomes these feelings, but how we are still connected to those who are gone through memories, love, and what shapes a connection that can not be severed through the realms of life and death. Many have defined Death Stranding 2's central theme as a game about grief and trauma, and whilst those are key things that are present in this game, I feel they are more drivers to what is the central theme of Death Stranding, which is healing. Whilst talking earlier about the necessity of the stick, that is the question posed by Kojima, but ultimately Death Stranding 2 is at its core about confrontation, and not just in that of justified violence, but confrontation of your own pain, hardships. It suggests that there is hope in connection and reconnection. It posits that for one to live their life to the fullest, they must stop running from the beach, aka their perception of death, and instead learn how to tread across it with others. Just before we reach the credits of Death Stranding 2, there is a quote that is put on screen, and it's another one from Koba Abe, the stick and rope guy, and this is a quote that is very central to what Death Stranding 2 is about, and I'll put it on screen for you, but I'm going to read some of it. Though the future is a product of every present that precedes it, tomorrow does not belong to today. To live is to imagine ourselves in the future, and there we inevitably arrive. Yet our place in said future may not be the one we envision. This is the perfect encapsulation of what Death Stranding 2 is trying to talk about with living your life to the fullest, and is ultimately what Kojima has been trying to get across with reintroducing the stick into Death Stranding 2. It's the perfect embodiment of this theme, as well as the character Tomorrow herself, as she is revealed to both be Lou and Sam's daughter. Sam may have lost precious time seeing his daughter grow up, precious time with her in general, due to the measures that Fragile took to protect her, but literally, Tomorrow doesn't belong to today. Her journey is a long one ahead, and there is a lot to really see, and the credits of this game really say that the things that came before are entrusted and instilled in those who walk the path in the future, and continue to pave that journey, that through our experiences and the things that we share, we are able to move forward and keep paving roads and moving ahead. The future that is both her and Sam that they share now, reunited as one, that they are able to have is something special, and is a connection that is even stronger than the one they shared when the game begun. To point to the previous theme, as those two themes are pretty interwoven into the understanding and purpose of loops, this is to instill the repetition and the message that connection is not just a one-time journey, but a constant commitment to connect and rekindle, to heal, to build, and to be vulnerable. And even if these things do open us up to pain, they are a necessity and what makes us, connects us, and pushes us forward. Death can't tear us apart. We will always be connected because life is circular, and we will always be connected through the beach, through the afterlife, through the memories we share, through the things where we all eventually arrive and reunite. Death Stranding 2 is ultimately a game about connection, but its takeaway and lesson is it wants to ask and answer, what does it mean to connect? What are connections that we form with people? What are the connections we form with the things we interact with, i.e. the internet, different systems? How do we form these connections with people, and how do we build those bridges to make sustainable and meaningful relationships that we form in this world? And I think although it may come across in its own Kojima-esque muddled way, it is something that is deeply thoughtful and profound. At its core, Death Stranding 2 is a more polished and evolved iteration of the original vision. The central gameplay loop remains familiar, delivering cargo, constructing a helpful infrastructure, and navigating an asynchronous world shaped by other players' actions. That foundation, the meditative rhythm of travel and connection, is still very much intact. However, this time around there is more variation in the loop. While standard deliveries remain a staple, Death Stranding 2 places a greater emphasis on stealth and combat. Several main missions revolve around infiltrating enemy camps, retrieving valuable items, and extracting safely. The game still encourages non-lethal play, but combat encounters are more frequent and dynamic, supported by a broader range of enemy types and scenarios than its predecessors. What stands out early in the experience is how much more open and accessible the game feels. Players are granted access to a wide array of tools, gadgets, and vehicles much sooner than before. This is a double-edged sword effect. It offers more freedom and creativity in how you approach challenges, but it also risks reducing the tension and challenge that made the original so distinct. The path of least resistance is easier to follow now, which may not sit well with those who valued the deliberate pacing of the first game. Some may note that the feeling of isolation and vulnerability, so central to the original, is less prominent here. And whilst I would say that is true, I feel it's a deliberate evolution rather than a misstep. In Death Stranding 1, the oppressive atmosphere worked because of the world's fractured state and Sam's initial detachment. The sense of solitude, danger, and spiritual reflection was baked into that journey. In the sequel, Sam is a changed man, and the world is, while still dangerous, no longer as desolate. Moments of tension, serenity, and reflection still exist, but they are contextualized differently. Death Stranding 2 ultimately feels like a more robust experience. The expanded toolkit, deeper combat systems, and emphasis on stealth add meaningful gameplay layers to the overall Death Stranding formula. One of the most welcomed additions, I feel, is the introduction of sub-orders, side quests that go beyond routine deliveries and standard orders. They offer narrative depth and world building to the world of Australia in Death Stranding 2. These quests help flesh out these deliveries, shelters, and the scattered areas across the Australian continent and give insight into the lives of the people who inhabit them and the more quirky characters that you will encounter. At the heart of it all, Death Stranding 2 retains the philosophical and systemic DNA of its predecessor. The way you move through the world, the way you plan your journey, and the emotional payoff of helping others still remains fundamental, but the flip side to this is an experience that feels less arduous, less tense, and overall in some areas it doesn't feel like that payoff from completing a delivery hits the same way it did that first time around. There are moments of relief when you complete deliveries in Death Stranding 1, and whilst I still had those moments in Death Stranding 2, I do feel like there was a lot of times where that music would kick in and I would just be driving across a plane like, oh, it's over already, like we're reaching the final stretch. Overall, I think a lot of what Death Stranding 2 sets out to do, it does very well, but I think it ultimately does stand out as a very different experience to Death Stranding 1. It doesn't just refine the core features of Death Stranding 1 and what came before, but it also carves out new ground, introducing systems and ideas that push the series into uncharted territory. Some may love this, and some who just wanted more of what that original formula offered may feel a little disappointed here. So I want to break up how I feel about the gameplay into a bunch of different components here. The things that I feel the game formula improved, refined and expanded in this journey, and the setbacks, the things that I feel kind of, whilst I don't dislike them, I feel detract from what that original experience offered. I also want to talk about its focus on combat as well. So I'm going to dive into all of these different sections now. Let's get into it. I'd like to start with the positives. Death Stranding 2 expands on the core formula in meaningful and satisfying ways, most notably through the larger arsenal of tools and weapons. These additions not only make things like enemy encounters feel more varied with the attempts of being more engaging, but also breathe new life into the delivery gameplay, enhancing how you traverse and interact with the world. We will explore these systems in more depth shortly, but it's clear that the sequel builds upon the foundations of the first game with a larger mechanical depth and a real creative angle to try and invoke a sense of player expression. One of the most welcome improvements lies in the quality of life features that makes planning and executing deliveries more intuitive and rewarding. Managing your cargo as well is now a far more smoother process. You can use Sam's rope to tie down cargo for better stability. You can auto arrange your cargo load directly from the quick wheel menu. You can even drop your backpack when needed to protect your gear or lighten the load, or if you're seeing BTs, you can kind of leave it there to go and address them. Things like this. These tweaks, while small in isolation, add up to make the experience feel a lot more flexible and smoother, and it's just an aspect of the game that is less tedious, and needlessly so, as I don't feel like these things added to the friction of the original, more just made parts of that game feel a little bit more cumbersome. At its core, Death Stranding 2 still centers around the act of deliveries and the asynchronous social systems of players that elevate the world around you. There's something deeply satisfying about navigating a route made easier by structures left behind by other players. The ghostly sense of teamwork, of unforeseen hands helping you forward, feels just as impactful as it did in the first game, and there were moments here where these new structures really did just come in handy, and I felt in a new way that I didn't in the first. It all harkens back to what I said. These games are very different, but also have this overlap, this Venn diagram where they are very similar. The world doesn't just respond to your actions, it evolves based on your contributions. The more you put in, the more the landscape begins to feel shared, lived in, and transformed by a collective effort. That still is the same here, and this is one aspect of the sequel that I feel like they really have elevated and built on. Beyond structures, the new gadgets and tools that exist outside the building systems, they add even more variety. While some people may like different things like the surfer coffin or the blood boomerang that do lean into Kojima's trademark absurdity, others offer practical applications like for stealth, traversal, and combat. That being said though, not every gadget is created equal. Some tools clearly have a more fringe or situational use case and may not see that much play outside of specific scenarios. Still, the broader focus of supporting both stealth and action ensures there's something here for every form of playstyle. In many ways, Death Stranding 2 feels more like an expressive and collaborative experience, one that engages experimentation, celebrates community-driven progress, and continues to reward the careful and contemplative act of simply putting one foot forward. And things like the monorail and the road network are just real big iterations on what came before, and it's just taking it and adding more and going to that next level. And those are the things that I really did like. The aspects of stealth and combat, whilst they do have their moments where they are satisfying, are elements of the game that I feel, whilst there is a better variation than the first game, still have ways to go. And that's where we're going to start things off with the setbacks. So now I want to talk about an element that I feel kind of mixed on, and it's the setbacks. And it's an area that I, post playing the game and finishing it, as I've kind of come to this conclusion on, and I feel a little mixed on. And it all is just can be summed up in one statement. It's undeniable that Death Stranding 2 is a more fun game to play, but is that necessarily a good thing? The sequel for Death Stranding, it's a more refined game, it's more bombastic, and it's far more generous with its tools. Early on, you were handed equipment and vehicles that in the first game would have taken hours to unlock through progression, at least in the original. The director's cut was a bit more generous. Vehicles play a much larger role this time around. With increased focus on combat as well, you are given expanded arsenal of tools to handle enemies, like weapons and ways to approach combat for every different scenario. This has added a lot of variety to the game, and it's it's fundamentally shifted the way the game plays. Yeah, there's a lot of moments and a lot of deliveries that you make in a traditional sense, but there is a lot more deliveries here that focus around driving from point A to point B, or extraction missions where you are infiltrating a base, taking down enemies, taking a piece of cargo and delivering it. And I guess my question here is, does this abundance of tools and do these new approaches really dilute what made that original game so special? For me, while I didn't take these approaches of brute forcing my way through every delivery by just opting to use a vehicle or doing things like that, I just kind of, I don't know why, I was a zipline guy and I just used those as soon as those became available to traverse around. And I do feel like there was like areas that did kind of push me to actually walk in certain areas, or maybe I was just dumb and doing it the hard way. I do feel like the inclusion of them and having this game be more focused around that does remove the tension of that original experience. Part of what made Death Stranding 1 so memorable was the deliberate pacing, the sense of solitude, fragility, and careful planning as you made each step across treacherous terrain. Here, that quiet struggle is softened. I can't help but feel that that shift has really begun with the director's cut of the original Death Stranding, where Kojima Productions included a lot of different tools and shortcuts that made this a lot more forgiving. In Death Stranding 2, this design philosophy is expanded, likely in the name of accessibility. That isn't to say that tension is gone entirely. There are still moments where BTs would catch me off guard, and there are still moments where like running through a camp would feel semi-threatening. I do feel that the abundance of weapons made camps and the ways you approach them feel a lot less of a threat than the mules in the first game were. But I do think things like BTs still on like main deliveries and things of that like nature really did posit some sort of threat in parts of the game. Most of the time though, I would say just like the first one, there was never really, because of your ability to repatriate and things like that, there never really was a moment of sheer full-on tension. And I do feel after a while the BTs in both games lose their sense of novelty and become less of a threat. Here in Death Stranding 2, I do think it's a bit earlier than its predecessor, but I think that both of them, a lot of people are saying, oh, they're not as scary as they were in the first game, but I chalk that up to novelty because I think both games, after a while, they did kind of lose it a little bit. Overall though, I do think that there are a lot of interesting ideas that they've put into Death Stranding 2. The weather systems and the way that they work are interesting and great on paper, but I don't really feel like outside of the floods and the occasional storms, we wouldn't really see much things like bushfires throughout the main game and things of that nature. And I wish that we did see a bit more of that, but I do think that this inclusion and these ideas are nice iterations and they do make for cool moments in the game. And I think there is a lot here that they really try to expand and pull out. And in a lot of ways, I think even Death Stranding's setbacks can be viewed as positives, because this game does really add a lot of tools and a lot of flexibility, a lot of approaches to combat, and a lot of ways that make the game more fun and expressive than in the first game. But I think the differentiation between these two experiences is, do you want that friction game where it's arduous and it's a pain in the ass to get from A to B? The terrain is your enemy and everything like that is really just makes each like endeavor and each journey feel like it could be your last, and it's super treacherous. But when you get to that final stretch and the music plays, you feel a sense of relief and respite, knowing that you can just see your destination in sight. Because I feel Death Stranding 2, whilst there are moments like that and they hit incredibly well, it feels like they are not as frequent and they don't hit as much as they did the first time around. There are moments in the sequel where I am thinking to myself, like, oh wow, we're already here at that end of that delivery, as I mentioned earlier. And it does lead me to question. But I do think that this also, like I said when I reviewed and talked about the first game, this is all intentional. And I do think that where the first game focused on the rope and purely on connection and building out that system, the sequel here is very strongly focused around the idea of the stick, not the rope this time around. That's why we have more focuses around combat, while we have the delivery system, whilst it's still the core central like theme running in Death Stranding, and the rope is still essential in Death Stranding, it is kind of a backseat to the more action focused elements of Death Stranding 2, and I think it works very well within the tones and the thematics, and gameplay wise there is nothing bad about what Death Stranding 2 does, but I think it does feel very strongly contrasted to what that first game was. And I think the people who won't like this game are the people who have and feel a very strong way about what that original title was, and by contrast of what this game is. But if you're able to look at these as two companion pieces of a game, where one is focused more around representing the need of of the stick and the first game being more of a need of a rope, you can really start to understand why these two games play and feel different, not only just in their narrative and their themes that they explore, but also in the gameplay mechanisms that they invoke. And I look at it in this lens and I'm able to appreciate and respect even things that I would consider setbacks for Death Stranding 2. Now I want to discuss the last component, the combat. There is no denying that Death Stranding 2 significantly expands the combat options available, offering a broader range of tools for both direct confrontation and stealth. This shift marks a noticeable departure from the original game's philosophy, which largely emphasized avoidance over aggression. While combat was lightly adjusted in the director's cut, the sequel adopts this as a fundamental approach, one where conflict plays a much more prominent role. This evolution ties directly into the stick versus rope philosophy introduced in the first game. Where Death Stranding is centered around building bridges and avoiding violence, the sequel acknowledges a harsher truth: some connections can be dangerous, and sometimes conflict is unavoidable. This idea, which we've touched on earlier, is no longer just a thematic idea, it's fully embedded into the gameplay's philosophy. From a mechanical standpoint, this manifests in delivery missions that play more like infiltration and extraction operations, rather than simply journeying from A to B. Some missions now involve planning a loadout, infiltrating enemy territory, securing an objective, and escaping. While these missions certainly add variety and can be quite fun, they often feel reminiscent of gameplay scenarios we've seen before in other action-focused titles. Personally, I found myself still gravitating towards the more traditional delivery missions. There's something uniquely compelling about charting a long, treacherous route and overcoming the elements as opposed to clearing out an enemy base. While the expanded toolkit undoubtedly offers players more freedom and expression in how they approach the world, it also offers and feels like some of the tension and friction that define the original has been somewhat smoothed out. That change appears intentional, driven by both accessibility and narrative direction, but it's worth noting. Death Stranding 2's missions may be more dynamic and more action-packed, but they sacrifice some of the meditative weight and endurance that gave the first game a distinct identity. In that regard, I still feel the original holds a unique edge over its successor. I'd now like to talk about the gameplay systems that underpin Death Stranding 2, starting with the Social Strand System, which form the backbone of the original Death Stranding and makes a meaningful return here in Death Stranding 2, and this time it's been expanded and refined in response to player feedback. Kojima Productions observed how much players enjoyed building and contributing to shared infrastructure, and they've doubled down on that core idea here in the sequel. New features elevate this system considerably. Not only can players now construct a circular road network that gradually reconnects the Australian continent, but a monorail system as well has been introduced. This allows players to mine and transport large quantities of materials across vast distances, enabling the expansion of roads, monorails, and other critical structures built within the world. The gameplay loop of contribution and shared progress feels more rewarding and engaging than ever. Several structures from the first game have also been reworked. Watchtowers now allow players to scan wide areas, tagging enemies and locating cargo more effectively. Zipline functions are more fluid as well, letting you easily scan for connected nodes and traversing across greater terrain with precision. Importantly, the pacing and structure of the tools that you get to build and flesh out this world has been improved as well. Players gain access to materials and construction tools at a steadier, more satisfying rhythm, allowing them to engage with the world and infrastructure at a more steady pace. And now that I say that the pacing of introduction of these tools may sound contradictory to how I'm talking about progression earlier, I'm mainly just talking here with regards to the structures and how they are introduced, because they allow you to really just get into this world and start to flesh out how you build and connect with other players. That said, this shift also means you'll be constructing roads and bridges earlier than you did in the original, where ladders, ropes define the early hours of gameplay. Here, the basic tools still have their place and remain scattered across the landscape, but the availability of things such as bridges and zip lines become more immediate in the sense of progress and collaboration than they did in the original. Just like before though, the joy of discovering these tools or bridges left behind by other players is still very much present, continuing that quiet magic of asynchronous connection. In essence, the Social Strand System functions much like it did in the first game, but with more polish, more options, and a richer sense of shared purpose. The system of giving and receiving likes to acknowledge contributions remains intact, but now it's joined by additional tools and systems that deepen the feedback loop and amplify the satisfaction of cooperative play. Even within the game's narrative, these themes are reinforced. Communications between Sam, Drawbridge, and other various settlements he now connects with, they work with like a social network infrastructure, sort of like Facebook or something. You've got like a timeline, and it replaces the traditional email system of the first game, and it does make a much more clear and concise UI perspective of where you can like read these different things that are going on at the different places across the Australian continent, and it gives you a better sense of like wanting to read and check in on how these places are doing. This new interface is not only the theme of digital connectedness, but it does offer a cleaner and more intuitive way to track these discoveries, updates, and Sam's overall progress through his journey. Despite the gameplay expanding in new directions though, the magic of the connected world that defined Death Stranding is still very much alive in Death Stranding 2, and despite many of the things that may be criticisms that I have about how the game tackles combat or how things are introduced at a certain period of time that may detract from that more meditative experience, I will say overall the pacing and the way that the Social Strand System and the structures and the way this whole game kind of interlocks with one another is still very much intact, and it still feels like it has been evolved and fleshed out in a very neat way. And seeing the paths and structures and choices of other players and their journey, it's still a powerful thing here in the sequel. The progression system in Death Stranding 2 builds directly on the foundation established in the first game, expanding and refining many familiar mechanics. Porter grades and delivery ranks return, continuing to serve as the primary way the player is evaluated for completing deliveries. As you reconnect various locations to the chiral network, you will be rewarded with new gadgets, tools, just like the original, but now there's a few additional surprises, such as like novelty cosmetics like glasses and hats. Backpack customization also returns, offering more modular options to attach battery chargers, balance stabilizers, and storage compartments, particularly compartments that focus around your grenades and your ammo, how much you can carry and things of that nature. This all gives you an increased level of control of how you gear up for each mission, with a whole ready to set out and different modules and sections that making sure you're ready with vehicles, backpack customization, loadouts, and all that stuff that is just included now in the game. Things from the director's cut, but like it's more refined and more baked into the DNA of Death Stranding 2. One notable new addition is the introduction of Sam's Stats, a gamified progression system that tracks your performance across different activity categories. These stats improve over time based on how you play, whether it's carrying large amounts of cargo, using stealth, or engaging in combat with specific weapons. While the game isn't overly complex, it adds a satisfying layer of gradual growth and specialization that encourages players to develop their preferred approach over time. These skill sets are also expanded and built upon with the more you use them as well. So when you lean into a particular playstyle, you will see your skills level up in these stats that Sam has over time. Where progression becomes more strategic is in this new section called the A-Pass point system. As you connect to different shelters to the chiral network, you will also earn A-Pass points. These can be spent to unlock and toggle enhancements across a skill tree. These enhancements offer gameplay modifiers such as improved traversal, better resource efficiency, combat buffs. They allow you to tailor your playstyle into different ways, and they can be switched on and off. They're like a pool of points that you can assemble into different nodes of a tree, but then you can activate and deactivate them. I kind of liken it to that OS system that's found in like Nier Automata. It works in a similar kind of way where you can mix and match and chop and change how you want to approach the game, your playstyle, and you're never really locked into one way, and it really does offer different modes of experimentation as well throughout your playthrough, because these nodes can be freely activated and deactivated. It encourages experimentation and adaptation. Moreover, completing standard orders and increasing your rank with settlements directly feeds into this system as well, creating an additional layer of incentive to keep exploring and helping others as well. Compared to the original, Death Stranding 2 offers far more ways to customize and fine-tune your experience. While the core loop of resources and cargo management remains central and, for the most part, very familiar, the sequel introduces more tools for planning, problem solving, and overcoming the obstacles in your own unique way. I don't know if I necessarily would call it a deeper system, but I do think that there is a larger plethora of ways to personalize this system of growth and how you approach many of the different obstacles that Death Stranding 2 posits. It's one that invites players to engage with its world and its mechanics and do it on their own terms, and I do respect that. Let's talk about the visuals, sound, and performance of Death Stranding 2, starting with the visuals, because simply put, this is one of the best looking games on a PS5 and arguably one of the most visually impressive titles released this year. The terrain in Death Stranding 2 is absolutely breathtaking, and the cutscenes are nothing short of cinematic excellence. With the quality of motion capture and the overall visual fidelity we've seen in recent years, it truly feels like we are moving beyond the uncanny valley. Death Stranding 2 stands as a shining example of how far the medium has come. Characters feel expressive, grounded, and human in a way that's incredibly immersive. Much of this is thanks to the Decima Engine, which Kojima Productions continues to push to its limits. From the arid deserts of Mexico to the snowy peaks of Australia, which feels weird to say, the engine renders vast and varied landscapes with remarkable detail. These stylized reimaginings of the real-world locations, filtered through the haunting post-apocalyptic aesthetic of Death Stranding, result in a world that feels entirely unique, even if it doesn't follow the traditional open-world design formula. One of my favorite visual touches is how Death Stranding 2 leans deeper into its sci-fi aesthetic, drawing heavy inspiration, I feel, from the likes of Metal Gear Solid 2's futuristic visual language. Whether it's the sleek designs of cyborg ninjas, the menacing ghost mechs, or the advanced manifestations of the chiral network, there's a distinct flavor of tech-noir futurism here that I absolutely loved. It feels like a natural evolution of the world established in the first game, yet wholly on its own in this different category, but still Death Stranding. It's weird. The environmental effects are uniquely impressive. Plate quakes that fracture the terrain, sandstorms, bushfires, and other dynamic hazards are not only visually stunning, but they add drama to the atmosphere, to the journey. Even if and when these are scripted, they never do fail to impress. The game's biome diversity gives every region a visual identity, enhancing that sense of globe-spanning adventure. Whether I was trudging through an ash-covered wilderness or basking in the orange glow of a dust storm, the urge to explore felt just as strong, if not stronger, than it did in the original. The best part, I played this on a base PS5, man, not even a Pro. I am blown away by this, and I'm wondering, when is this coming to PC, and how good is this going to look on PC? Because for a base PS5, this game is just technically a marvel, and the artistic achievement in this game as well, the direction and everything, it just proves Kojima Productions is operating at the top of their game. And if there is one area that I feel pretty confident that Death Stranding has a strong chance of winning later this year, it is art direction, man, because they just had it down pat with this game. Now let's talk about the soundtrack for Death Stranding 2, which once again features Ludwig Forssell returning to compose the score, and his work is nothing short of phenomenal in this game, just as it was in the first. This time around, Forssell's compositions are joined by the haunting and emotionally charged sounds of Woodkid, whose contributions fill in the space left by Low Roar, taking the center stage of this game, and it's a fitting energy really for what Death Stranding 2 was going for. Woodkid's music brings a different emotional palette to the table, less folk and more ambient, more cinematic and dramatic, yet perfectly captures the quintessential Death Stranding feeling. The quiet moment of solace when you spot a distant shelter, the sense of accomplishment you feel as you reach your goal, and the weight of a journey you've taken to get there. These moments, when they do hit in this game, still just feel as impactful and powerful as they were in the first game, where Low Roar's music often leaned into haunting melancholy and ambient sorrow. Woodkid's tracks in Death Stranding 2 invoke a more layered emotional tone. Pieces like Are You There channel an eerie introspection, while grander tracks like Minus 61 feel powerful and triumphant, and it's a great segment to kick off this game. Together, they help redefine the mood of the sequel, keeping it emotionally familiar, yet giving it a distinct sonic identity that complements its evolved themes and atmosphere. but you still get a good return as well of the artists from the first game. You will see Low Roar and hear them in this game, and you will also hear the Silent Poets as well, and some songs from the first game making a return, which was a nice surprise. As for the performances, the main cast, once again, outstanding across the board. One performance that really stood out to me was Troy Baker's return as Higgs. In Death Stranding 2, he is even more charismatic and menacing, delivering a performance that feels larger than life. Every scene he appears in is instantly elevated by his presence. He completely owns this role this time around. Another highlight I really feel is Norman Reedus as Sam Bridges. While his performance in the first game was often subtle and reserved, matching Sam's emotionally guarded persona, Death Stranding 2 allows the character to open up more. Sam has more to say, more personality, and more opportunities for growth, and that gives Reedus the space to fully embody him. It's a great evolution both for the character and the actor, and it adds emotional depth to the story and more to the quieter moments. And I feel like for a game that's really trying to deliver this gut punch or this narrative around loss and grief, it really is great to see a more vulnerable side of Sam expressed in this game, where he gets to interact with more people and converse a bit more, and it's good. Overall, the performance for Death Stranding 2 is really solid, and throughout my playthrough, I did not notice any issues. I spent a considerable amount of time testing both quality mode and performance mode, and both delivered impressive visuals and maintained stable frame rates for what they were offering. When during some of the most graphically intensive moments as well, I did not notice any dips or any issues. Visually, the game is striking in either mode as well, so there's no major real issues, and I'd suggest just playing on performance unless you just really want to get that heightened fidelity in every little bit of it. However, following the completion of my playthrough, reports began to surface of the game causing the console to overheat. This appears to be tied to the software rather than the hardware, meaning it is something that is an issue with Death Stranding, the game, and at the time of writing and recording this video, the issue has not yet been officially addressed or resolved. So if a patch or fix is released by the time this video is out, I will put in a note and I will say this has been fixed. But otherwise, I would say that is the one cautionary thing about this game on the performance front. Outside of that, everything else, and from my experience, worked particularly.
Me, I've always loved porters. We'll never leave a trace where you walk. If the only path you take's the one you're told, so walk away, I'll find you. So
To bring everything together, Death Stranding 2 is to me a truly special game. It carries forward many of the themes explored in the first entry, but reframes them as a response, a retort, even to the questions and conclusions Kojima posed in the original. The outcomes may echo familiar ideas, but the lens through which they are viewed has changed, shaped by new context, new perspectives, and by Kojima's own evolving worldview. The gameplay reflects this as well. It's not simply a rehash of Death Stranding 1's systems, it's a parallel journey that may lead to a similar destination, but offers different methods and meanings along the way. It's a game that invites you to think, to feel, and to engage in ways that are both familiar, yet unexpectedly new. Some may disagree with me calling this Kojima's best work since Metal Gear Solid 3, but that's genuinely how I feel, in terms of pacing, structure, thematic weight. Overall, it is just a great holistic package. Death Stranding 2 tells the most cohesive and emotionally resonant story he has crafted since Snake Eater, whilst at the same time providing systems and evolutions that feel like they all click together in ways where there is no apparent strong shortcoming. Whilst certain gameplay elements may lack the tension and raw friction that defined the original, this sequel isn't trying to replicate that. Instead, it forges its own identity, not an iteration, but a divergence. Much like how players once longed to play as Snake again in MGS2, I suspect that many will initially yearn for that feeling of Death Stranding 1, but in time grow to appreciate what the sequel offers in its own right. But with all this being said, Death Stranding 2 is not a perfect experience either, and neither was the first. And like its predecessor, it is a deeply meaningful game, but for an entirely new set of reasons. Whether it's the emotional weight of its narrative, the introspective lens Kojima offers on the reflection of life, legacy, and human connection during COVID, or the expanded world and refined toolset that pushes the Social Strand System even further, is an experience that says a lot and says it with intent. Though their games may walk different paths, I do feel like Death Stranding 1 and 2 are fantastic video games, and if the series was to end here, I do think there would be some sort of beauty in that, because I think there is a lot to say this game in this series is a great duology that works hand in hand together, and a terrific companion piece. The stick and the rope, Sam and Lou, digital connectedness versus in-person, all of these things work so well, and I feel that these games both try to set out to walk similar paths but tell different stories, and though they may be different, at its heart, Death Stranding 2 still carries that same quiet beauty, that same essence that made that first game so memorable, and it's the very heart, the unshakable core, the purpose and connection that makes me love this series as much as I do. And seriously, Death Stranding 2 is an incredible video game, and this series is something special. Thank you for watching.